This is a continuation of History 1301. We are 1607 to 1650, and we're starting to talk about the English. Here's a nice lead-in slide for you. We're going to talk about the Jamestown settlement first. We'll talk a little bit about the London Company and what's going on back in England. We'll take a look at this. This is, I want to be clear on this. This is a commercial settlement. This is going to be all about the money. Later on, we'll talk about what's going on in terms of spirituality, religion, but this is all about the money. So we'll talk about some of the personality, John Smith, John Rolfe. We'll also talk a whole lot about Native Americans, Powhatan, also known as Opechancanough. His daughter Pocahontas, later on her adult name will be Matoaka. We'll talk about that. And Opechancanoug's brother, Wahun Sunakak. And we'll talk about some of these Native Americans. We'll talk about the headright system and how we're going to get more and more English people to come to the New World, come to the English colonies. War will break out. Then we'll talk a little bit about mismanagement to royal colony. Now later on, and this will be in a different presentation, we'll go on and talk about the Plymouth Bay settlement, the Mayflower Compact, and how this theocracy is going to work up in Massachusetts. Your readings are still in your text, chapters 1, 2, and 3. So let's go on then to the first slide. The first couple of slides that you see here, there's going to be a lot of verbiage on that, so just get ready to take really, really super strong notes. Let's go on to the next slide. Now on these two slides, obviously you can just, if you're computer savvy, obviously, you can kind of stop the presentation here and just do a screenshot and then print that. Then you can go back and follow along with what I'm about to say. But this slide and the slide following are going to be a lot of verbiage, and we just need to get this sort of thing out of the way. Now, I mentioned before in an earlier presentation, when I give you a slide that's got a whole lot of verbiage on it, just take really, really super strong notes. So this is background information. When we talk about Jamestown, I want you guys to be clear on this issue. It is a commercial settlement. It's all about the money. Now, as a historian, I am a transatlantic community historian. I believe that America is all about transplanting a bunch of Europeans to the New World. And so we have to continually go back and forth across the Atlantic. So for the background on the Jamestown settlement, we need to start with, back in England, a joint stock company. Now, a joint stock company is very simple. It's just the modern forerunner to a modern corporation. In England, this had been a relatively, in 1603, when Elizabeth starts the East India Company, and then later on in 1607, when Jamestown is established under James I, English commercialism was kind of in its infancy. It was just becoming, it was just emerging into a more modern era that we would recognize today. And one of these is going to be a joint stock company. An example of that is a joint stock company. So all you're doing is having an idea. A group of businessmen are going to get together, going to have a great idea. Well, to raise money to make that great idea take place, they simply go around, typically to rich, wealthy, elite people, and they say, behold, I have this really great idea. We're willing to sell stock if you'll just give us capital, if you'll give us a capital investment, if you'll give us money, and then you'll get a rate of return. And so it's just a corporate setup. There's nothing mystical or magical about this. I have a couple of examples up there. The EIC, for those of you guys who don't know, the EIC is the East India Company. It was founded in 1600 by Queen Elizabeth. It's one of the last things she did in her long reign. And the East India Company was nothing more than a very highly sophisticated joint stock company. But obviously it's going to be more famous in India than in the West Indies or in the New World. But the Jamestown Company and the Plymouth Company, these are the corporate interests behind these colonies. All of these colonies, these early colonies, are going to be founded by means of, the money behind the colony is by means of a corporate interest. So the Jamestown Company, sidebar, the Jamestown Company later on will change its name to the London Company. So when I say the London Company or Jamestown Company, those are interchangeable. And the Plymouth Bay Company, the Plymouth Company, that's going to help found the Plymouth Bay Colony later on. Now, the next thing is a charter colony. And I want to be crystal clear on this. This is an example of the English taking their laws with them. It's not written down there, so please make sure you write a strong note on this. The English are going to be taking their laws with them when they go to the New World. So they're not going to simply arrive on the North American continent and say, okay, well, you know, here we are and we're going to start doing our thing. No, they go to get permission from the crown, from the parliament, or from the king. So they have to get permission to actually found a colony. And that permission slip is a charter. So a charter colony, Jamestown, Plymouth, Massachusetts Bay Colony, all of these are going to be charter colonies. And so a group of people, typically the investors, they go to the king or to parliament, as the case may be, and they say, listen, we want a permission slip to start a colony in the New World, or anywhere. The New World, the South Pacific, you know, in India someplace. If they're going to start a colony, they need to have a permission slip, and that's going to be a charter. So then the king or parliament is going to outline the territory, their rights, the basic foundation of the colony itself. They're going to give them a permission slip, and these are actually these are legal documents. Without a charter, any one of these colonies could be subject to attack or protest by any one of the adversaries of England. And the king would have like no choice but to like withdraw the English people from wherever they're at because they have no charter, they have no permission slip. So most of those early colonies are going to originate as a charter colony. They're going to go get a permission slip from the king or parliament, depending on the time frame when this is actually going to take place. And that's their foundational document. Without that, they're not going to be able to start a colony. So a charter, this is an example of the English taking their laws with them. With all that in mind, let's go on to the next slide. The next issue that's important here is a proprietary colony. Now, this is related to a charter colony. The difference is that an individual is going to approach Parliament or the king and say, for whatever reason, they want to start a colony. Now, in practical terms, there's usually a religious side to this. But they're going to go, an individual is going to go to the king or go to Parliament, try to start a colony, going to get a permission slip, and then the colony itself becomes a proprietary colony. So Pennsylvania is a good example of that. William Penn is going to go to the king, I think Charles II, and ask for a document, ask for to start a colony. And he's wanting this for the Quakers, and we will talk more about that later when we get Pennsylvania colony founded in the 1660s. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. In Maryland, the situation was slightly different. The Calvert family back in England were Catholics, and they maintained their Catholicism. Well, the leader of the Calvert family in England was Lord Baltimore. And so Lord Baltimore, a Catholic, is going to say, listen, we Catholics are being persecuted here in England. Let me have a refuge for English Catholics in the New World. And that is the foundation then of Maryland. And so we'll talk about that later on. And I'll give you a clear and unambiguous example of that. The last thing I want you guys to know about a proprietary colony, the proprietor, whether it's William Penn or the Calvert family or whatever the case may be, the proprietor is going to have a great deal of influence in the governance of the colony. The Penn family, for example, they gave everybody, the king and the American colonies, the other colonies, fits the whole time, right the way through the American War of Independence. The Penn family was very, very influential in how their colony was run, and they were giving everybody fits. So let's transition on then to the royal or a crown colony, and a good example of that, New York and North and South Carolina. So here, there's kind of two pathways to become a crown colony. But here, the king in parliament is in control of the colony. Now, the king in parliament, write yourself a sidebar on this. The king in parliament, you see I have it hyphenated there. That is the office of the king, regardless of who the monarch is. No matter who the monarch is, whether it's going to be James I, Charles I, later on Charles II, James, Mary, or Anne, whoever the monarch is, that is the office of the king. And so the king in parliament is going to be basically the ultimate leader of this colony, if it is a crown colony. So the two pathways then, the colony itself begins, it originates as a crown colony, or it transitions from being a proprietary colony, in the case of Maryland and New Jersey, or it starts out as a commercial colony in the case of Virginia and Massachusetts. And so it starts out as a proprietary or a commercial colony, but then transitions to a crown colony. In the case of these commercial colonies in particular, the company's simply going to fail. Well, the English people that are in the colony still need to have a permission slip. But the company, the investors that went and got the charter in the first place, they're no longer in business. The English people in the colony actually still need a permission slip, so it simply transitions to a crown colony. Their commercial charter is revoked and is replaced with a crown colony charter. And so once again, the king appoints the governors. The charter itself is going to establish the basic rules of the territory, and they're going to say, okay, this is where your colony is actually located physically. And so all these charters are like really, really important documents as we talk about English colonialism. And please bear that all the way in mind, all the way until we get to the American War of Independence. So the English are bringing their laws with them. They're not simply, there's a sort of train of thought out there that suggests when these English, in particular, came to the colonies, that they were suddenly independent, that they were this magical, mystical creature called an American. That is not true. That was never the case. They brought their English laws with them. They saw themselves as transplanted Englishmen, and that's what the law says. So by 1720, all but Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Delaware are crown colonies. And Pennsylvania will stay a proprietary colony all the way to the Revolution, the American War of Independence. And Maryland, I think in the 1750s, just before the French and Indian War, the Calvert family really loses interest, and Lord Baltimore is long gone, and so it reverts to a crown colony as well. So now that we have some sort of background, let's go ahead and put all this into practical application with the foundation of the Jamestown colony in 1607. So the Jamestown colony, May 6, 1607. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not big on dates. This one you have to know. I'm not big on dates. Please write this date down. May 6, 1607. This is the foundation of the Jamestown colony. And the reason why it's there is money, money, money. So let's start at the start with this. Now, I've mentioned this before, and I said you were going to need it, and now you do. The role of the pirates, Henry Morgan and Bartholomew and Sir Francis Drake and even Sir Walter Raleigh when the occasion arose, what these guys are doing really, in broad terms, is transmitting the message that in the New World there's nothing but gold and silver. And that all you really have to do is knock some Native American on the head and take his gold and silver. The Spanish were doing it. And in England at the time, everybody considered that any Englishman was worth 10 Spaniards. So if you follow that train of thought through, well, if the Spaniards are making this much money by knocking Native Americans on the head, and any Englishman is worth 10 Spaniards, well, I'd be able to make 10 times as much money. So, sure enough, and this is a reference to our lead-in slides, a group of investors went to the rich, wealthy, and elite and said, listen, we're going to start a colony in the New World with the hopes of getting gold and silver. So the initial motive for Jamestown is to make bank. It's to make money. Go to the New World, set up a colony, start interacting with the Native Americans, find out where the gold and silver is at, and start getting that. Make money. These investors expected a tremendous rate of return on their investment. But of course, the startup cost of the colony was enormous. The English state was, in point of fact, quite poor. They were always on a very, very strict budget. Especially James I and later Charles I. Parliament's going to be very adversarial to them and not want to put any money at all in this. So the only way these colonies are going to get founded is a group of investors, in this case the London Company, also known as the Jamestown Company, are going to go to a bunch of rich guys, barons and earls and bishops, and say, listen, give us a pile of money. We're going to start this colony. And then once we make gold and silver like the Spanish are doing, we're going to pay you back your investment. So in those early days, everybody was very, very enthusiastic about this. But the cost is hideous. You've got to get a bunch of people together to do the job. You have to charter some ships to transport your people. You need all sorts of equipment and food, and all that was extremely expensive. But in 1607, May 6, 1607, the ships arrive, all the background work is done, the ships arrive, and everybody gets off the ship, and they get busy. Now, strong note here. When this first batch of colonists arrive, their intuition is that there's gold and silver basically everywhere. It's just lying around waiting to get picked up. And in those early days of the colony, they didn't want to put forth any effort or do any work. They wanted to go out there looking for the gold and silver that they were convinced was just lying around like Easter eggs. All you had to do was look around for a little while, you could find it. Now that turns out to be the case, as it turns out, but that won't happen until way later, and we will talk about that later. But while they're out looking for gold and silver, they're not actually putting in what you and I would refer to as the infrastructure of the colony. So let's talk about that for a minute. Now, the image that you see here is probably a pretty good artistic rendition of what the colony looked like in those very early days. The colony is going to be located in modern-day Virginia. They go upriver on the York and the James River, and the ships say, okay, the ship captains say, look, this is as good a spot as any, and, they pull up next to the shore and begin unloading all the stuff. The food, the supplies, the hardware, and, immediately a lot of these guys are going to go out there and they're going to start looking around for the gold and silver. Well, they're not putting in the infrastructure, and that is kind of what you see here on the slide. They need to start putting together a sort of a fort. They need to get this kind of triangular fortress built up. And that takes a lot of manpower and a lot of effort. Another issue that needs to be done right away, they got to put in a well. Now, obviously they can't drink the water right out of the river there that you see in the background of the image. It is a tidal basin. In other words, when the tide is in, then the water is salt water. You can't drink it. When the tide is out, it's very, very brackish. And you can't drink it. So you've got to build a well. Well, I know that you guys are not familiar with actually hand digging a well. But you got to dig a hole, obviously. Well, if you just dug a hole, very soon it would cave in. Obviously, right next to the water, so the water level is, the water table is fairly high. You don't have to dig the well deep. But once you get the well in, you have to line it with stone. That means you need to go inland a little bit, find all kinds of stone, cut it all up so that it's more or less like a block, and then send it down the well to some guy at the bottom of the well who's, lining it so it won't cave in. Furthermore, as you're digging this thing, you're going farther and farther and farther down, you have to go below the water table. If you just got to the water table and stopped, your well would only ever yield up mud. So you need to go way deeper below the water table. So somebody's down the bottom of this black, hole, obviously. It's a well. And they're suffocating, and they're handing up the dirt that they're digging, and they're getting deeper and deeper until they're basically, kind of neck deep in this water that's coming in. Then they've got to line it with stone, And then, got to get out of the well. So what I'm driving at with this story is even the simplest things are extremely difficult to do. When we're talking about putting in this infrastructure, the simplest stuff is extremely difficult to do. Think about the walls of their little fort there. Now, this particular kind of fort, it's a wood fort, obviously, but it's a palisade. That's what that's called. Well, the first thing you have to do is dig holes so that you can put the uprights in. And the uprights are obviously they're going to be trees. Well, then you got to go inland, chop down a specific kind of tree, and it's got to be about the right size. It can't be too big or too small. Then chop it to an appropriate length, and this is all done with axes, and that's extremely hard, back-breaking work in the flaming heat of the Virginia sun. Then take it back over to your location and set it upright, and then lash it into place and pound the earth into place. Just continue on thinking of the practical application here. You have to have guards at night because you don't know what's really going on in the wilderness out there. You know Native Americans around, but you don't know anything about them, so you got to have guard duty at night. So at night you're on guard duty, and all day long you're like working really, really, really super hard. Well, somewhere along the line you got to cook some food. So some of the guys are like set aside to like cook food during the day. Well, this is all extremely hard, back-breaking work with very little sleep. And so the work here is extremely difficult, and nobody wants to do that. So the leader of the expedition, more about him in a minute, came up with a simple law. Strong note here: if you don't work, you don't eat. Now, the leader of the expedition will be John Smith, Captain John Smith. We'll talk about him again in just a second when we talk about myth versus reality. But Captain John Smith said, listen, if you don't work, you don't eat. He controlled the food. The food was the rations that they offloaded from the ships, the ration that came all the way from England. Salted fish, salted pork, and various sorts of, oatmeal and dried peas and things of that nature. So he controlled the rations. He said, if you don't work, you don't eat. And that was the only way to really motivate these men to build the infrastructure necessary to stay safe and stay in the colony, set up a colony. The last thing I want you guys to know before we transition to the next slide is the ships that you see in the background, they don't want to stay there. Either they want to get back to England before the weather turns bad, or they want to go down to the Caribbean and they want to go buccaneering. They're not there to help the colony. They're there to make money. And while they're tied up next to the shore, they're not making money. So as soon as the ships can leave, they will. They're not going to stay there for very long at all before they've got to go. The ship captains are all very, very anxious to get the heck out of there. Now, this has nothing to do with the Mayflower, by the way. That'll be later on. The names of the ships, one of them was called the Elizabeth. There were several others. But in those early days, the ships are not going to stay there. They've got to get on with it. So the expedition, the colony, they're really working hard to get the colony up and running. One other note before we move on, I'm not going to talk about the Roanoke colony that was set up earlier in the 1580s by Sir Walter Raleigh. And that colony is going to fail. And the reason we're not going to talk about that colony is very simple. It didn't go anywhere. It failed. We're not really, to this day, no one is really sure what happened to the colonists. Most of them probably starved to death, and the rest of them were absorbed by the local Native Americans. Some information is emerging on that as we apply modern research techniques. But the colony itself, that was in the 1580s. It didn't go anywhere and nothing happened there. But we are going to talk about, we're talking about Jamestown, and we're going to continue on with that because something actually happened here. This became a viable colony. So with that in mind, let's transition on, and we're going to talk about the early days in Jamestown, and especially Captain John Smith, a lot of myth and some reality. Let's transition on and let's start talking about myth versus reality. Now, early colonialism, myth versus reality. That's kind of the title of the slide. So let's talk about that first contact between the English now and the Native Americans. So the local Native Americans in that area were called the Powhatans. Powhatans, the Powhatans. Their leader was Opechancanough. Look to an earlier slide to find out how you spell his name, and I think I have it spelled a little bit later on. But among the English, obviously the phrase Opechancanough, which was his name, the leader of the local leader of these the Native American tribe, that was hard for them to say, as it would be hard for you to say. So he's referred to by the name of his people. In other words, Opechancanough can be called Powhatan, and Powhatan Opechancanough. The name of his people is Powhatan. His name is Opechancanough, but they're interchangeable. This was a conventional habit back in Europe as well. You could say, okay, England is going to do this, and England is going to do that. And that's the king saying that. And so the king would call himself England. So it's not odd for anybody to think of one of these Native Americans calling by the name of his people. So don't be confused by that. Now, my resource on this is going to be Karen Ordahl Kupperman, and her book is Settling with the Natives, and later on she did a whole lot more research and then reissued that book as The English and the Indians. And Karen Ordahl Kupperman, Chapel Hill, UC Chapel Hill, she's the expert on this. This is her thing. So she gives us a lot of the resources on Captain John Smith in those early days with the Native Americans. And so if you're really interested in this period of history, Karen Ordahl Kupperman, Karen Ordahl Kupperman, Kupperman. She wrote the book on this. And when I say she wrote the book, well, that's what she did. She wrote the book. So we have Powhatan on the one side, and the Powhatan people. Now, Opechancanough Powhatan, he is one of these great sachems. He's the leader of, many tens of thousands of individuals. So when the English arrive, they're in close proximity to the Powhatan people. And that leads to the story of Captain John Smith running into these Native Americans, which happened in the very first few weeks of the Jamestown settlement. Now, the story goes that Captain John Smith and two of his men went off into the woods hunting for some food. Some kind of wildlife to supplement the food that the men had gotten off the ships. So they go inland a little bit, they're hunting along, and they got bagged by a couple of Native Americans. Now, again, as the story goes, we only have Captain John Smith on this. More about this later. But he said, listen, the other two guys got killed right away. And John Smith, got captured. Well, he was taken inland to Opechancanoug's, main village. And there, evidently, he was trying to take the buttons off his coats and the belt buckles off of his shoes to trade to the Native Americans and try to indicate that he was trying to be friendly and outgoing and not a threatening individual. So that first meeting is going to be kind of a negative thing. But John Smith establishes a sort of a relationship with Opechancanough, and says, listen, I'm here as a peaceful trader. So a few days later, John Smith emerges out of the woods. He's been gone for 4 or 5 days, and he has to tell the guys, the rest of the men in the expedition, this is what happened. Now, I want you guys to think this all the way through. Captain John Smith is a military leader. The way he got the job was, back in England, he'd been adventuring, buccaneering probably, in the Mediterranean. And he happened to get caught by some Turks. Well, while he was in Turkish captivity, he finally worked his way, got free. Back in England, he applies for this job, and he said, yeah, when the Turks had me, these Saracens, that's what he called them, when they had me captive, I had a lucky break, and I snatched a sword from one of them and knocked off 3 heads with one blow of the sword. And so the London company said, well, you've got the job then. So when we talk about Captain Smith, I want you guys to understand he's very resourceful. So he comes stumbling out of the woods. 2 of the other guys got killed. And that's like a terrible blow to the rest of the men. And they're really short on manpower anyway. So John Smith comes up with a story. And he says, yeah, I was about to be killed when this young Indian maiden, Pocahontas, saved me. Well, that was almost certainly a made-up story. Did they have any kind of interaction? Yes, Captain John Smith and Pocahontas, later Matoaka is going to be in her old name. They do have an interaction. I want to be clear on this. Pocahontas was a real person. Pocahontas, from what we can tell from the Powhatan language, means the precocious one, or the one that's always seeking attention, the one that scampers about. She really was the daughter of Opechancanough. That's true. But whether or not she saved Captain John Smith, that's highly unlikely. You can see a couple of images here, one from the one in the center there, kind of from the 19th century or early 20th century, and the one in the upper right, certainly from the 19th century, the mid-19th century, and it's a highly romanticized view of what had happened, the story. But the story is almost certainly apocryphal. You can kind of see there in the what would be the lower right, this kind of Walt Disney image with a no sign on it. Our image today of Captain John Smith is this big, handsome guy with lovely hair and a wonderful singing voice, and Pocahontas, this really super attractive young Indian princess. That's Walt Disney, and that's not the way it was. So first off, Captain John Smith, and that's kind of clear on the image on the far left, he was actually this sawed-off little runt of a guy, and he had a small man's attitude about life. He was very adversarial as an individual. Furthermore, and several resources talk about this, he was probably suffering, and this happens a lot, from a vitamin C deficiency, which gives you scurvy. And one of the signs of scurvy is you have really super bad breath. Now, it could be that he just had good old halitosis. But everybody talks about how he had really super bad breath, and he had a really type A personality. He was very energetic. He was very a very aggressive personality. And so he's not anything like the Walt Disney version at all. And the story about Pocahontas coming to save him, that can't be true either. For those of you guys who don't know, Pocahontas was about 8 years old at the time. So there was like no relationship that you see in these images here, and certainly not a relationship that you see in the Walt Disney version. I'm sorry to wreck this cartoon for you all, but yeah, she was about 8 years old at the time, and Captain John Smith was in his early 30s, I guess, at the time. So that story that Pocahontas saved him, that's almost certainly a made-up story that John Smith created to cover for him being captured and losing two of the men to being killed by the Native Americans. Again, all the players here are real players. John Smith, Pocahontas, Opechancanough, they are real people. But the story, yeah, that's completely bogus. So let's continue on now that we've done, got a little bit of myth and reality out of the way. Let's continue on. We're going to talk a little bit more about John Smith and then how they continue on to interact with the Native Americans. Now, a little bit more about John Smith here. These are some of the maps of some of the works of John Smith. You can see that's how they're labeled. In the upper left, you see the phrase, the descriptions of part of the adventures of Captain Smith in Virginia. And so here is a map drawn by John Smith, and then it's kind of tuned up a little bit later on, but this is the basic map by John Smith. The image on the right, where it says New England, and you see John Smith's picture up there, kind of in the corner, and it says, this is drawn by John Smith. So he did, in fact, draw this map. Now, what's important about these two drawings is, if you take either one of them and overlay them over a modern map, you can kind of tell what John Smith was trying to drive at. You can tell what he's trying to convey. Now, think what that really does mean. Imagine if I set you down somewhere, off the coast of New England or somewhere in Virginia, and gave you a sheet of paper, a big giant sheet of paper and a pencil. Could you draw a map that's reasonably accurate with a scale of miles, with directions, north, south, east, and west? Could you do that? Well, of course, most of you couldn't. I certainly couldn't. But John Smith did. So here's what's important about that, about this. I want you guys to think big. John Smith is the leader of this expedition. He's taking his job very, very seriously. So he's writing down everything that happens as a record for anybody that should follow after. He's taking notes on behalf as an agent for the corporation. He's taking these notes in all these directions and everything he's done and everything he's said and all the activities that's going on in the colony to aid the corporation in running the colony. So he's very meticulous about this, very businesslike. In the lower left, you can see an early image of what Pocahontas, what his residence looked like. It's what we would call a longhouse. There he is, got a fire going in the middle. This is what John Smith saw. He described it to another artist, and this is what we get. So when we think of John Smith, I want you guys to think of him as a businessman. He's a businessman. He's working on behalf of the corporation. He's a very meticulous, careful record keeper. And, you know, he's not just this handsome guy singing and dancing his way through some, you know, Walt Disney cartoon. And so that should give you guys an idea of what's going on with Captain John Smith. Now, the next thing I want you guys to know about this, and continue taking strong notes here, what I'm going to talk about now is those early days of the colony was not as easy as we think. In other words, it's not a straightforward event. There were two periods, 1611 and 1612, and another one on further on down the line in the 1616, that are called the starving time. Now, for the purpose of this class, we're going to throw them both in together. A ship had showed up on the harbor. They were trying to like pull the colony together. Captain John Smith had gotten these guys to working. They had the basic palisade all set up. He had established some relationship with the Native Americans. Again, more about that later. But it turns out that he was like cleaning a weapon or whatever he was doing, and the powder blew up in his face, so he was injured. So he told everybody, listen, I'm going to like go on this ship and I'm going to go back to England, get more supplies, get everything I need to get now that I know what we're up against and have a clear idea of what we actually need, and get healed up. I'm going to see a doctor and try and get this terrible wound, this flash burn, healed up. And I'll be back. Well, so John Smith gets on the ship and off he goes. Well, as you can all imagine, when the cat is away, the mice will play. So sure enough, without Captain John Smith there to actually run the colony and keep an eye on things and exert some genuine leadership, the other guys in the colony, they start, you know, loafing around. They eat all the food. They don't go out and, you know, plant anything to harvest to eat. They're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. Let me give you an example of that. For any of you that's done any cookouts, especially over an open fire, or camp out over an open fire, then you know full well that it requires a huge amount of like wood to keep a fire going. So imagine the amount of wood that you need to, like, you know, cook your hot dog or roast your marshmallows or whatever it is you're going to do. Well, now you need to like stay warm throughout the winter. That requires that you go out into the woods and like chop down all sorts of like lumber and trees and turn that into firewood. And that's extremely hard, back-breaking work, and you need a vast treasure of it. Well, if you don't do those things, when the weather does turn bad, it does get cold, that's too late. It's already freezing out there, and that's too late. So you can very easily freeze to death. Well, again, Captain John Smith is away, so these guys are not laying in the wood. They're not taking care of all the things they need to take care of in order to survive. So this is called the starving time. To give you an idea of how bad it was, the men concluded that what they were going to do is put together a raft, just lash together a bunch of logs and stick up some kind of sail and take this raft and try and get back to England. Well, obviously that was not going to work. They were going to die. But their situation was so desperate that that was their only plan. And they'd actually got this raft put together and gotten some little bit of food when, lo and behold, it's one of the turning points of the colony. So, make sure you kind of put a little bit of a note on this. Just as they were getting ready to shove off on this stupid little raft, they were going to die. They looked out, and sure enough, over the horizon was several ships, and on the ships was Captain John Smith. And they said, "Hey, I'm back. I've brought more people. I've gotten individuals that are probably going to be able to help us on the colony. I got more food and equipment, all the stuff that I know that we're going to need." And so the decision was made then to go ahead and stick it out, to go ahead and give it a try. And again, that is a turning point in the colony. So, sidebar, when we talk about those very first guys that arrived in 1607, they were probably the wrong people. There are several resources that talk about this, but it's hard to get clear records on it. But the first guys who actually arrived, they were not farmers or, carpenters or bricklayers or any of the guys that the colony actually did need. They were simply kind of adventurers like John Smith himself, who said, "Listen, I'm going to go over there and I'm going to pick up a bunch of gold and silver and come back to England." But as more and more ships go back and forth from England to the Virginia colony, the company takes John Smith's advice and begins sending people that are actually necessary to build the colony. Guys who can do the woodworking, do the agricultural work. Guys that know how to do that, how to actually sink a well and get it all lined, and they know how to do that. So those early years were not simple. They were not easy. It was very, very difficult indeed. So with that in mind, let's transition. Let's stop talking about Captain John Smith. We'll run into him a little bit later on and continue talking about the continuing development of the colony. Now, 1612, John Rolfe arrives, and in about 1612, you'll note that little circa symbol up there. It could be a year or two earlier, it could be a year or two later, but in roughly 1612, John Rolfe arrives in the colony. Now, he is going to be the one that actually marries Pocahontas. You can see her picture over there, Matoaka, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. But what we need to do now is put the colony on a paying basis. I cannot overemphasize this. The whole idea behind this colony was to make money for the investors. This is a money-making adventure for everyone involved. And they did not find gold and silver. For those of you guys that have given this any thought, then you know that in Virginia, it's not really famous for a whole bunch of gold and silver mines. It's just not there. Well, the English obviously didn't know that. So they're looking for a way to make the colony pay. And John Rolfe is going to do this when he develops a commercially viable tobacco. So, strong note here, I have a picture of it there, Nicotiana rustica, that's tobacco, that early tobacco. So, the Roanoke colony and had brought a little bit of tobacco back to England all the way back in the 1580s. And this is, it didn't go over very well. They tried it, and evidently, I've never smoked a cigarette in my life, so I don't have any idea about this, but evidently that tobacco in those early days, the 1580s, was very, very harsh, very difficult to smoke. Sir Walter Raleigh had brought this stuff back, and it just didn't work out very well at all. And then the colony failed, obviously, because they couldn't, they couldn't support it from England. But John Rolfe is going to develop, I want to be clear in your notes now, he did not invent tobacco. That already existed. That was already a thing. But he develops a way to either cure it or to make a specific strain of tobacco that's much more fragrant and less harsh. A lot of theories have gone on about this, about exactly what he did, how he cured it, whether or not he cured it just exactly right, or what he did. But the result is identical. He actually makes this thing smokable. Now, listen to me carefully. And you can see it, I have it written down over there in that kind of purple on the lower right. This is all about tobacco culture. Write that down. I have the exclamation point there. This is a big deal. Now, this is what's important. Tobacco will grow in Virginia. and it travels well. In other words, you flatten out the leaves and you put it in the bottom of a barrel, and you get a whole big giant barrel full of tobacco leaves that will easily go into the hull of a ship. The ocean's a highway, not a barrier. You take it back over to England, and you can sell that tobacco. Well, the corporation wants to make money, so they systematically go about creating a tobacco culture. And this is to get Europeans addicted to tobacco. Strong note here. This is going to be important in England, but the idea is your target market. You're trying to get everybody in Europe addicted to tobacco. And this worked perfectly. They're still addicted to tobacco today. As you all know, I spent many years in Europe. I lived there for a long, long time, and everybody smokes. Everybody smokes to this day. So your target market is everyone. Now, for this, we need to go back to Europe. In England, the Dutch are going to be doing the same thing. In England, they're going to be doing this. In Germany, the northern states are going to be doing this. Imagine, if you will, you've got a little bit of tobacco. Pull out a little pouch, and you start smoking on this. Now, what you're going to use is a pipe like you see there in that little black and white image. This is called a church warden pipe. And the reason why you have that really, really super long stem is because you don't have in a modern pipe, you would have a carburetor. That's actually what it's called. But a carburetor tends to put out the sparks from the burning plant matter. Sidebar, if you guys are smoking, stop. That's a terrible habit. Don't do that. But people did back in those days didn't know that. So the London company is going to tell everybody, listen, this tobacco, it's a miracle drug. Oh, it'll get rid of tuberculosis. It will drive away the evil vapors. It will, it's going to aid this disease or aid that disease. And so they're going to tell everybody this. And so they're going to drive up demand. This is an economic argument, so we're using economic language. The demand curve for tobacco is endless. If there's no upper limit to it, your target market is everybody. And the product is smoked. In this case, it literally goes up in smoke. So if the supply is limited, you can only grow this stuff in Virginia. Finally, they'll be able to grow this stuff in the southern parts of France, but it's such a stinky crop that nobody actually wants to do that. So you can only grow it in Virginia, you can't grow it in England. So your supply is limited, but your demand is unlimited. The supply for tobacco is limited. You can only grow it in Virginia. But the demand is unlimited. So that is a place where you can make a whole lot of money. This is a straightforward economic issue. So you're trying to get everybody to smoke these things back in England. So imagine then, back to the story, you're standing around, you got a patch of tobacco, you load up one of these crazy church warden pipes. It's real long like that, so that by the time the smoke gets all the way up to the end of the pipe, the sparks have gone out. Furthermore, these are communal pipes. So you get ready to hand it off to the next guy, and you got, saliva all over the end of it. Well, you just snap off a little bit of it and hand it off to the next guy. Well, he puffs on this thing for a little while, and then he hands it on. Okay, so you get out your pouch, you've loaded this thing up, you've taken a few drags off of it, and you're talking the whole time. And then the pipe goes out because you smoked it all up, and then you tap it all clear, and then you load it back up again with your tobacco, and then you get an ember out of the fire or whatever, and you smoke some more. Now, there's something more going on here. All my friends who ever try to stop smoking said they can't go to a bar because you have to have something to do with your hands. And that's what this tobacco culture is really all about. Number one, you're showing off your wealth. You're wealthy enough to be able to go get tobacco. You have enough money to get that and purchase it. And you're showing this. Second, it just makes you, it's so habit forming. You have something to do with your hands while you're in some tavern or something and you're talking to all your buddies. Or it's evening and you just want to relax a little bit and you smoke a pipe. Okay, well, if we go large with that then, and everybody in Europe is doing that, then the demand is endless. Not to mention the fact that Nicotiana rustica is highly addictive. So that's where the money's going to be made. One of the big draws of the Virginia colony, one of the big money makers right through colonial times, right until really the modern age. Tobacco is going to be a gigantic cash crop. Just an incredible amount of money is going to be made on this. It travels well. It's a product that's going to be used up. There's going to be an endless demand for it. Your demand curve is unlimited. Your target market is just, in effect, everyone is your target market. And so you can make a lot of money on this. So John Rolfe is going to make the colony pay. Now, let's transition on and talk about Matoaka. John Rolfe is going to be married to Matoaka. Now, that's her image that you can see there on the right. And there are several other pictures of her that you can find out there if you really look at this, but that's probably what she actually looked like. The image was drawn from life, and there's a few things going on here. Number one, the clothing that she has. I want to be clear on this. When John Rolfe married her, he married up. But more importantly, Matoaka, she is a genuine, a true Native American princess, and everybody said so. So her marriage is kind of a signal from Powhatan, Opechancanough, that he is okay with the colony. He wants to have an alliance with them. He wants to work with them. Again, more about that later. So his daughter, Matoaka, is going to marry John Rolfe. Well, John Rolfe made a lot of money off of tobacco. He made bank. So one day he said, well, I'm going back to England. And he's going to take his wife with him. So what's important about her image there is that she, strong note here, she was received in England as a princess. She was accepted in England as a princess. So John Rolfe, he'd married a princess. So while he was a commoner, she was going to be traveling in the highest circles of English nobility. A symbol of that, you can see that little fan-looking thing that she has in her hand there. Those three feathers, that represents the Prince of Wales. That's the symbol of the Prince of Wales. So she almost certainly actually met then the Prince of Wales, which was Charles I, later Charles I. Her clothing is very high-end. That kind of funny-looking hat that she has on there, that's very Tudor, very Jacobean, very late Elizabethan. That big giant embroidered collar that she has, that lace collar, very typical for the time. So that's almost what she certainly actually looked like, what you see here in the image. So she was accepted as royalty among the English royalty, which gives you an idea of how the English felt about Native Americans at the time. Again, my resource on this is going to be Karen Arnold Kupperman. She writes about this a lot. Richard White, the Middle Ground, we'll talk about more about him later, and he says the same thing. In those very early days, the English accepted Native American royalty as being royalty equivalent to what European royalty was like. Now, Matoaka's story is rather sad in the end. Obviously, she had no more immunity to diseases than any other Native American. So she stayed in London for a few years. Again, traveled in the highest circles of English society. And then it's unfortunate she caught a disease. It's not clear what the problem was. It was either measles, smallpox, but almost certainly it was tuberculosis. It was almost certainly tuberculosis. So she died. She passed away. Now, having said that, she has one of the best grave sites in all of England. She's buried in St. Martin in the Fields in England. And so St. Martin in the Fields, the church itself is right there on Trafalgar Square. And the graveyard is really, really tiny. It's right in downtown London. And the graveyard is really tiny, but you can peek over the fence and you can see her gravestone that says Matoaka, wife of John Rolfe. I have no idea where he's buried at, but she got a top burial location in London. But what I want you guys to get out of this slide is, again, to kind of sum up here, John Rolfe is going to make the English colony commercially viable. The product that we're all interested in now is tobacco. It's an agricultural crop. Again, we'll tie that in a little bit later on. And the Native Americans, the other big issue that I want you guys to get out of this slide, the Native Americans in those early days are going to be accepted in England as a people with a polity equal to that of any European. Later on they're going to be seen as nothing but savages. A phrase that, again, Karen Orla Kupperman explains very carefully in her book. And, more about that later. So with all that in mind, let's transition and continue on with the development of the English colony of Jamestown. Now, what's going on here? So, in a very short period of time, it's going to become perfectly obvious that there's no gold or silver in the colonies. Now, settle in, because we've got to spend a lot of time on this particular slide. And on this particular slide, what we're going to get out of this is our thesis statement regarding the English and their interactions with the Native Americans. So in England, it's becoming increasingly clear there's not a whole lot of gold and silver in the colony of Jamestown. So this means that no one wants to go there. No one wants to go there. So there's only one meaningful way for the London Company to keep more people going to the English colony at Jamestown. And this is going to be the headright system. So for the headright system, we have to go back to England. Now, we're back in England. We've spread our magical wings. We're all the way across England. It's, kind of the early 1600s, and we're trying to get people to be motivated to go to the colonies. Strong note here. Now, to make a long story short, every square inch of land in England is spoken for. Every inch of land in England is spoken for. That goes all the way back to the invasion by William the Conqueror in 1066. In 1087, he caused a sort of a book to be drawn up. It's called the Doomsday Book, and doesn't have anything. It's not sinister. It's a corruption of the Latin phrase domes. So Domesday Book is the book of the house. And in that, William the Conqueror had everything, William of Normandy had everything in England itemized, inventoried, because his premise was he conquered it. It was his stuff. Other people just happened to be closer to it. Well, obviously he couldn't rule. He could rule, but he couldn't govern every stitch of land. So he turned to all of his bishops and barons and earls and all this, that, and the other, and he said, okay, you have this little area here, and you're going to be the Bishop Odo, his brother-in-law. You're going to have that little area over there, and you're going to have this area over here, the De Veres. And he said, okay, you guys have this little area, and you govern that because of me, through me. Well, all the bishops and earls and barons, they weren't going to govern it either. So they said to their knights, okay, you have this little chunk of land, and you have that little chunk of land, and this little area of land over here is yours to keep an eye on. And the knights all said, well, okay. And then they turned to, they weren't actually going to go do the farming, although that did occasionally happen. They turned to the peasants who were already on the land and said, okay, you farm it. Then on harvest time, the knights, they gathered up all the harvest, and they said to the peasant, okay, this is your little bit. And I'm going to take a bunch of this in taxation. Then all the knights went to the bishops and the earls and the barons and said, okay, I've taken my little slice. Here's the rest of it. And the bishops and the barons and the earls, they said, okay, thanks a lot for all that. We're going to take our little slice, and we're going to give the rest of it to the king. This is a very extractive system. Well, over the many years, the bishops and the earls and the barons said, you know what, we've been governing this for a long time. I want full deed and title to it. And whoever the king happened to be said, okay. And over time, the knights and their families said, listen, I actually want deed and title to the land. And the bishops and the earls and the barons said, well, okay. You're loyal, and I'll give you deed and title to the land. So now we're arriving in the 1600s. And the number of actual, strong note here, the number of actual landowners in England is tiny. 2%, 3% tops. That's it. So the land is critical. There's lots and lots of people in England, but nobody owns the land. Just the top 1 or 2% own the land, actually have deed and title to the land. Now, continue on with a strong note here. Very strong note here. If Back in England, if you have deed and title to the land, you have something really, really super critical, and that is the vote. You have the vote. That was kind of articulated in the first Magna Carta in 1512. Later on, I'm sorry, in 1215, other way around. And then later on, in the ones in the 1300s, it kept on identifying who might be a voter. So in 1600, and you might, if you had a whole lot of property or a whole lot of rents, then you had the vote. But that's still only maybe 2, 5, 7%, something like that, of people have the vote in England. But in the colonies, there's something else going on here. So now we're up to 1618. And the corporation says to the people in England, listen, if you will go over to the New World as a worker for the colony on behalf of the company, and you stay there for a set period of time, we will give you deed and title to the land. And that will locally give you the vote. Strong note here, that is something that an English person would never have gotten back in England. Never, never. The company is saying, if you will go over to the New World and work for us for a set period of time, more about that in a minute, you will get deed and title to the land, and that will, politically, that will give you the vote. So first let's talk about your target market. Your target market is never the rich, wealthy, and elite. They already have it made. Some of them will go to the colony because they're told to go by the king. You know, you're the governor, you got to go over there. Okay, well, the governor will go over there. But he's already rich, wealthy, elite, and he's doing a job for the king. Your target market for the head right system is not the middle class. They already have it made. The middle class such as it then existed. Business owners, doctors, lawyers, you know, professionals. That was the then middle class. Again, a very small group of people, but they already have it made. They've already made bank. And so they're not going to go to the New World either. They have no need. There's no call for them. So your target market, strong note here, for the head right system is the lowest of the low. That's why I have that kind of picture of those guys like being punished there. So you go to these people who are the lowest of the low, the company will go to them and say, listen, you know, you are a nobody, you are a nothing, but you do have a strong back, and that's what we need in the colonies. So if you'll go over there on our behalf with a contract and you work for several years, we're going to give you deed and title of the land. And under those circumstances, many will go over there. Your target market for the people that go to the New World is going to be the low, people that have nothing. Now, in the upper left, you can see they're going to go over there, and the cash crop, the big cash crop, is going to be tobacco. So many of these people that are involved in the head right system are going to be agricultural workers. Please write that down, agricultural workers, because that's what it's all about. They're going to be making that tobacco. They're going to be packing that stuff up, and you can see there. I have a couple of advertisements back in Europe about tobacco. You can see some Native Americans down there and some people making it. And they're like, "Hey, here's the best stuff, and you can get it in Bloomsbury Market or wherever it is." So with all that in mind, well, let me take that back for a second. So the head right itself. Now your book will talk about this some. And I want to be clear on this. The amount of time you had to spend as an indentured servant, the amount of time you had to spend with this indent, that's what that's called. You go over there with this contract, you're an indentured servant. The amount of time you have to spend over there varies with the skill sets you're bringing. The amount of land you get varies with the skill set that you're bringing. So, for example, if you're a blacksmith, which they needed desperately, then your indenturement might only last 6 months, and you might get a big chunk of land. If you're just a sod-busting farm worker that, you know, they recruited you out of jail and said, you know, we'll pay your fines to send you to the New World, your indenture might last 5 or 6 or 7 years, and you only get like 50 acres. You'll get some little bit of acreage. So the indent, that is to say that your period of servitude, is going to change with the skill sets that you're bringing. If you're a brickmaker, you may get a good deal. If you're an actual successful farmer back in England, you might get a good deal. But if you're an absolute down-and-out nobody living under a bridge, you're not going to get that good of a deal. So with all that in mind then, That leads us then to our thesis statement with the English. So again, strong note here. Our overarching thesis statement goes like this. The Europeans, primarily the Spanish, the French, and the English, had different ways of dealing with the Native Americans. For the Spanish, it was trade's increase, spread the word of God, plunder and glory. For the French, it was a mutually beneficial relationship based on the fur trade. For the English, land equals money. When we talk about a thesis statement which delineates, which defines the English relationship with the Native Americans, land equals money. The only thing that the English ever wanted was the land, because they had no access to the land back in England. Land gives you the vote. The ownership of land means you can put crops on there, especially tobacco. Later there will be other crops they could sell for cash back in Europe. That was the only way to make money. What defines the English relationship with the Native Americans, land equals money. The Native Americans had the land, the English wanted it. That's all they will ever want. And the way they get it, they knock the Native Americans on the head and take their land. So, with that in mind, land equals money. With that in mind, let's transition and continue to talk about the development of the English colony in Jamestown. So, 1619. We're going to spend a lot of time on this slide. So again, settle in. If you need to take a break, press pause or something, go take a break, because this slide's going to take forever to get through. 1619. This is a pivotal year for the Jamestown colony. So a little bit of a sidebar. We're not going to be able to go at the Jamestown colony almost year by year like this. We can't do that. So after this slide, we're going to start going by 10-year increments or 20-year increments. We're going to get up to the events of 1688 and the 1670s and 1688 pretty quickly. But these slides that we've been talking about up to this point, and the next one as well, these are building blocks. So please take strong notes here. 1619, a pivotal year for the Jamestown colony. I have some bullet points here. Please take strong notes on each one of these bullet points. The first one, the harsh rule of law is eased. Now, for that one, I want to draw your attention to the image there on the top. Here we are, circa 1620s. The archaeology is pretty clear on this. A short little sidebar here. I guess about 10 years ago, an amateur historian said, listen, I actually think the Jamestown site is still there in Virginia. The Parks Department had said pretty clearly, no, it's long since eroded away. But this amateur historian said, well, now listen, I have a ground penetrating radar thing, and I think it's still there. I want to take a look. So the U.S. Park Department said, yeah, okay, take a look, but it's long since gone. It's in the bottom of the James River. There's nothing left. Well, this individual started taking a look around with this ground penetrating radar and with a series of metal detectors, and he found the Jamestown site. Well, as soon as that happened, the big shots, they came out of nowhere, and they were going to take over the whole thing. Well, Karen Ordell Kupperman, again, she got involved. This was her deal. They found the wells. They found grave sites. They found all sorts of artifacts from the actual Jamestown settlement. So when we talk about this artist conception here, that's actually pretty accurate. That's basically, you can see that triangular fort-looking thing. That's what it actually looked like. That's about the size and the shape of it. But by the 1620s, the Jamestown settlement has grown considerably. And so by 1619, 1620 or so, there's about 350, 400 guys there, somewhere in that region. So with that number of people there, the harsh rule of law can be eased. In other words, that you don't work, you don't eat, that can kind of go away. There's enough supply ships coming in from England on a routine basis that you don't need that anymore. They have enough land in agriculture where there's plenty of food for everyone. Agriculture, usually produces a lot of surplus. Everybody there is trying to work very hard to get control of the land. They've overcome any kind of climate problems that had caused agriculture to fail. They'd overcome that, and so this is now a viable colony. About 350, 400 people, somewhere in there. So no more need for a harsh rule of law. No more, if you don't work, you don't eat. You can kind of get rid of that. The second bullet point, July 30th, 1619. Now we know this. The governor at the time, Roger Dale, I think was his name, he had written this down, and Captain John Smith, who was still very active in the colony, he points out that the first General Assembly of Virginia sits. Now, again, what I really want you guys to get out of this idea of the first General Assembly seated on July 30th, 1619, is that the English are bringing their laws with them. Now, we'll talk more about this again in a little while, but I want you guys to think about the number of people who are actually in the General Assembly. The General Assembly is always only going to be the actual landowners. Those are the guys who have gone to the Jamestown colony. They've stayed there for quite some time. They've worked on the land. They've worked out their indenturement or bought out their indenturement. And so they're indent. And so they actually have deed and title to a chunk of the land. But for reasons which will become clear in a little while, this is still only a very few people. Furthermore, and I get this from American exceptionalist historians all the time, this is they're going to say that this is our first step towards independence. That is not true. That's not even conceptual. There's just no way. In other words, what's really going on here is that when the first General Assembly sits, it's just a matter of common sense. They sit down and they say, listen, maybe we need to build a new dock for the ships that are coming in and going. You know, the one we put in 2 or 3 years ago, it's not working anymore, it's rotten, blah, blah, blah. We got to put in a new dock. Well, they have to contract for labor for that. Or somebody's going to say, listen, you know, the whole place stinks. Let's do some, let's fill in some latrines and make some rules about, you know, where the outhouses are going to be. And so you're going to make rules about that. The roads have to be done in, or some new contract has to be made with the Native Americans. More about that later. So when we talk about the General Assembly, we're only talking about a few people who are the actual landowners. And all they're doing is talking about the common sense running of the colonies. There's nothing revolutionary about this. It is just the exhibition of English law as the men who were there knew it. So, transitioning then, the summer of 1619. We don't know the exact date, but 90 women arrive in the colony. Now, think this all the way through. The colony started in 1607. That was 12 years earlier. And with a very few exceptions, there were no women in the colony. I'll say that again. The colony had been established 12 years earlier, and with a very few exceptions, there were no women in the colony. One of the governors had brought his wife over. She stayed for a year or two, and she said, I'm going back to England. And she took her girl servant with her. So there were there were just no women there. 350, 400 men, no women. Now, in your notes, it's not on the slide, so you have to write this down. There are 3 parties who are involved there. And we're going to go over those very carefully. So, again, settle in. It's going to take a few minutes to get through this slide now. And I want you guys to take very, very careful notes here. There are 3 parties who are involved here. The men, the women, and the company. 3 parties involved. The men, the women, and the company. So write down the men, skip 2 or 3 lines. Write down the women, skip 2 or 3 lines. And then write down the corporation, skip 2 or 3 lines. So let's talk about the men first. Now, I know some of you who are listening to this right now, you're like kind of rolling your eyes and kind of giggling, and you're saying, okay, well, I know what the motive of the men was. You know, they wanted somebody, you know, warm and cuddly to, like, you know, snuggle up next to on some cold night. No, that's not it at all. You have to think more broadly. You have to be more analytical. Now, let me be clear. Jamestown was settled as a commercial colony. Its entire purpose was to make money. But the men who are there are deeply, deeply religious. England at the time was going through a period of deep spirituality. This is part of the Protestant Revolution, and we'll talk about that again. We've talked about that before, and we'll talk about it again. So the men were deeply religious, deeply committed to the Protestant faith. And in the Protestant faith, these men knew that according to the scriptures, men and women had assigned roles. And this makes a community that would be ordained by God. According to the scriptures, I don't know, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and all in through there, men and women have defined roles within a colony, within any community. Well, that was not happening in Jamestown. It was almost an all-male society. And this meant that, in turn, some of the men were having to do tasks on a day-to-day basis that were typically the role of women. Cooking and cleaning and taking care of these household chores. Men were doing that. And that meant that this was a community that could not possibly be ordained by God. Well, think of the strong spirituality of these men. If they're in a community that cannot be ordained by God, then if you die in that community, you might find yourself in hell. You may have to ask, you may have to answer some really strange questions when you die. And so the men kept telling the London company, listen, you guys got to fix this. We don't want to die in a community that is not right in the eyes of God. So that is a very, very big deal. And so they said to the London company, and you can kind of see the great seal of the London company there on the lower right. The men were telling the company, you have got to get some women over here because we want to be ordained. We want to be a community that is right in the eyes of God. Faith was a big deal in those days. People believed that the sun itself came up over the horizon because the almighty hand of God brought it over the horizon. This is long before the observations of Copernicus or Da Vinci back in Europe. The Renaissance was still going on full steam. And so the science was not challenging religious concepts. So everything that took place was done from the will of God. Well, so these men want an ordained community, and that motivates the company. Well, with that in mind, then let's transition to what the women are up against. What role do they play? Now, again, I mentioned this before. Let me mention it again right now. You have to figure out your target market. Who exactly are you going to recruit as women to go to the colonies? Well, it's not going to be the royalty or the nobility, the aristocracy. They've already made theirs. They're not going to go over there. Hard back-breaking work. Nope, they're not going to do that. You're not going to get women from the middle class either. They already have theirs. They've got it made. They have no need to go over there. They're not going to send their children over there. They're going to take care of their own. So you're talking about the lowest of the low. Now, again, we're back in England now, and we're looking for women. So imagine, if you will, you're some farmer or some city dweller, and in an era long before there's kind of any birth control, you may have a large family. And so you've got your oldest son. That individual is going to be taken care of. That individual is going to get the business. He's going to get the farm. He's going to get something. The oldest daughter, she's going to be taken care of similarly. She's going to get a dowry. A dowry is a sort of a bride price. You have to pay somebody to marry your daughter. But think of that third, fourth, fifth, sixth daughter. Again, this is an era of large families, and you have 2 or 3 daughters that may have survived into adulthood. Well, now what do you do with them? And to be clear, the best that any second or third or fourth daughter can hope for is to be a servant in somebody else's household or a tavern girl, but most of them are going to be condemned basically to prostitution. And as has been pointed out by several other historians, their life is going to be short, brutal, and unsatisfying. It's going to be very, very bad. So these are the women that you're going to approach. I don't mean to suggest that the only one you're going to get to go across to the colonies is prostitutes, but you're going to be able to get women of the lowest orders. And here's what the companies has to offer them. There's lots and lots of surviving records that show this, especially the company records, which are still there. You can read them anytime you want. Go to the National Archives in Kew Gardens back in London, and you can read this stuff. The company's going to find these young women, and they're going to say, listen, we're going to offer you, if you're in any kind of debt, we're going to help you out. If you're in any kind of minor legal trouble, we're going to help you out with that. We're also going to give you 2 or 3 suits of clothing. That seemed to be a big deal, giving people clothes as a compensation for, whatever the deal is that you're trying to make. But most importantly, and please write down a strong note here, the company's going to look at these women, these unfortunate people, and they're going to say, listen, we're going to put you in a position where you can marry a man who has access to the land. And by that I mean access to deed and title of the land. These women are going to be offered an opportunity to marry a man who has the vote, who can be a big leader in a community. I continue on with a strong note here. This is something that these women would never have been able to get back in England. Never, never. They never would have been able to do this back in England. So you offer these women 2 or 3 pairs of changes of clothes. Then you say, we're going to pay for your way to get over to the New World, and then we're going to put you in a position to marry a man who has access to the land. And so, evidently, in the summer of 1619, 90 women took that deal. Now let's put this into practical application. The ship is going to arrive, and you can imagine, and as it turns out, there's some records that talk about this. A ship's sail was spotted over the horizon. Some guy in a canoe went out there and said, hey, who are you and what's going on? And the answer was, hey, this is who we are, and we're from the corporation, and, we brought the girls. The guy in the canoe turns the canoe around, speeds back to the coast, goes about the Jamestown settlement. Hey, the girls are here. Imagine, if you will, all the guys out there in the fields and all over town, they're trying to put on their cleanest, nasty shirt and comb all the burrs and all the stuff out of their hair and trying to get themselves spruced up and get down there to the beach, down to the docks, and here comes this shipload of women. Well, how do you divide out 90 women between 300 to 400 men? Now, I know that you guys are laughing about this because I get laughter in class every time I ask that question. But this is a matter of practicality, and that leads us to talk about what the company's going to get out of this. There are 3 parties here: the men, the women, and the company. Now we're talking about the company. Now, what does the company want? They want a viable community. They want to satisfy the desires of these men to have a community ordained in the eyes of God. But they've invested in these women. They've gotten changes of clothing. They put them on a ship. That was not for free. The company's not in the business of doing anything for anybody. They're in the business of making money. So how do you divide these 90 women into men? Ladies, you're going to love this. What we're going to do is we're going to stage an auction. Now, this is fairly well documented. Both Richard White and Carrot Ordahl Kupperman and most of my other resources talk about this. We're going to have an auction. So, strong note here. The men are living in a cash-poor society. Like, nobody has any cash over there, and they're not making any cash money. Whatever cash they happen to have, they brought with them when they came to the New World, and that wasn't much. So how do you auction these women off? How does the company benefit here? There are 2 things that the men have that the company wants: years of service and the land. So let's put this auction into practical terms. The ship's captain, the agent for the company, stands up on the dock and he says, okay, here's my first young lady, and her name is Elizabeth, and, she's got this going for her and that going for her, and here are all of her attributes. What am I bid? And the first guy will say, I'll give you a year of my service and 10 acres of land. The next guy says, I'll give you 18 months of my service and 2 acres of land. And it will go on like that until somebody says, enough is enough. This is all that this Elizabeth character is worth. Well, off she goes, and the second young lady steps up, and here's Mary, and she's got most of her teeth, and she's got this going for her and got that going for her. What am I bid? And it will go on like that until all of the women are basically sold off. Now, they're not slaves. They're not. Slavery was illegal. But they are, they're married to these men, and that makes them, subservient to their men. That's just the way it is. I don't know how else to put it. It's hard to explain. So what did the men get? They got a community that is ordained in the eyes of God. That's much more equal in the eyes of God, much more balanced. And so they feel very, very good about that. Now, again, the idea of getting a helpmate, somebody that's going to take care of, the household chores, that can't be denied. There's no denying that sort of thing. But I can't overemphasize this. The men feel much better about their community in the eyes of God. What do the women get? Well, they've got a man that had access to the land. Now, strong note here, because we need to go back over this really quickly. We've got these women sold off, essentially. There's another aspect to this I want you guys to understand. Please make a strong note here. In the colonies, and demographics after demographics, record after record show this, the mortality rate among the men is going to be much greater than it will be among the women. Like all the way through the colonies, well into the 1700s. The men are going to work themselves to death. It's going to be very dangerous. There's going to be wars one after another. We'll get to that later. And so the mortality rate among the men is much greater than it is among the women. So, this woman got auctioned off. She married the guy on the spot, essentially. And then, 6 months later, the guy's dead. Well, the woman is going to inherit. Now, debt in those days was not inheritable. His debt died with her. That will change over time, but that's a separate issue. So she got whatever house there was and whatever land it was. She got that. Well, many is the record that showed that these young ladies, they're going to be burying some guy, and before they got out of the cemetery, this is actually true, they had an offer to be married. And so they're going to have 2 or 3 men trying to marry them. Well, they're going to marry one of them. And then he's probably going to die. They stayed together for 2 or 3 years, and then he's dead. Well, then she got the property from the previous marriage and his property as well. Now, the minute she gets married, the man assumes control over this. But the woman, and record after record after record shows all this, women are going to have a great deal of influence over the property that they're bringing to the marriage. The man has control over it, but the women have influence, okay? So after you've married 2 or 3 guys, there's no foul play here. This isn't some murder scheme. These women are not, black widows. It's just the nature of life in the colonies that the men are going to die sooner. They're just going to work themselves to death. And so some of these women, over time, they're going to accumulate quite a little bit of wealth. And so this is a dynamic that does not get enough understanding. But again, to summarize, what happens next? Did the men get what they wanted? Yes. Did the women get what they wanted? Yes. Did the company get what they wanted? Yes. They have a viable colony. They got land that they can give to other prospective colonists, immigrants to the colony, and they got years of service from these men. So all 3 of the parties who were involved in this, they made out. They got something positive. They got a deal. They got what they wanted. So the fall, 1619. The first Africans arrived by Dutch traders. Again, on this one, if you need to take a break, press pause, go get something to drink. This is going to take a few minutes to get through. Now, I tried to phrase this very carefully, and I'm going to try and use very careful verbiage here. Because occasionally you'll see on the the History Channel, or some other resource, that the first slaves arrived in 1619. That is not true. Please underline that. These people are not slaves. So let's start at the start and try and figure out what's going on here. Now, our only resource on this from the original source documentation is Captain John Smith. He actually wrote this down in his logbook. I've talked about that. And he actually wrote in there a sentence, very cryptic. He said, a Dutch ship showed up on the harbor, and they offloaded some Africans, and then they left. And that's all he basically said. That's it. I think he used the number 70. I can't remember now, 35, whatever it was. But he said they arrived on a Dutch ship, and they're gone. Now, this drives everybody who's a student of this era absolutely crazy, because no one else in their records or in their diaries talks about this. No one. We don't get more references to African coming from Africa or the Caribbean until the 1650s. And by that time, the laws changed. So let's zoom in on this a little bit, as none other than Karen Ordahl Kupperman did in her book, The English and the Indians. And so she wrote a whole chapter on this, and she said, listen, I'm going to zoom in on this. I'm going to get to the bottom of this once and for all. And as a good researcher, the first thing she did was go back to Holland. She went back to the Dutch libraries, and she looked everywhere. In Leiden and Amsterdam, she looked through all the company records, which are still there. And she looked everywhere she could for an echo of this event on the Dutch side. Any logbook, any kind of mention of this on the Dutch side, she couldn't find anything. So then she said, having looked everywhere for any kind of evidence on this, she had to come up with a theory. And as it turns out, later research showed that her theory was absolutely right on the money. It was right on the money. So her theory went like this. Some Dutch ship, well, we won't know who it is. We did find it out later, but we went down into the Caribbean, and they went buccaneering. We've talked about that before. They went pirating. They knocked over some Spanish settlement and stole their slaves. So the first thing I want you guys to get out of this, the Spanish, by the 1600s, were already bringing slaves over. They already had a strong system of bringing slaves over from Africa. We'll talk more about that later. But a Dutch ship went buccaneering, hit some Spanish settlement, and did not leave this important asset to the Spanish, and that was these African slaves. They took these Africans with them. Again, I'm trying to be very careful in my verbiage here, because the next thing Karen Ordahl points out, and it's important, under Dutch law at the time, there was no slavery. So the instant those African slaves, who were clearly slaves under the Spanish, but the instant their feet went onto a Dutch ship, they were free. That's the law. The minute those African slaves of the Spanish, set foot on a Dutch ship, they were free. That's the way it was under Dutch law at the time. This is clear, it's unambiguous, and it's in black and white. However, this Dutch ship had no need of those individuals back in Holland. Back in Holland, there was a labor surplus. The economy was going through ups and downs, and there was a labor surplus. These Africans had no connection with the Dutch. They didn't speak the Dutch language. They were not of the Dutch religion, and the Dutch community at that time was highly, deeply religious. And they were not going to have, they didn't want to feed these people going all the way back across the Atlantic to no advantage. There was no place for these Africans in Holland. So it's perfectly obvious that the Dutch ship captain, whoever he was, concluded that the best thing to do was go up to this English settlement and just dump them off. Now, we've talked about this before. Let me say it again. The Dutch and the English were very often, they were allied. So there's nothing odd about this. So sure enough, this Dutch ship showed up in Jamestown and just dumped off these useless mouths to feed. Now, let's follow that dynamic. The minute, under English law at the time, the minute those slaves, no matter what else is true, the minute they set foot on this English colony, they were free. Under English law at the time, no slavery. Now, this will change later on in the 1650s, but at the time they were not slaves. But we can't figure out exactly what relationship these individuals had with the Jamestown settlement. In other words, they did not have an indent. They didn't have a deal with the company. They couldn't be just, sold away. They weren't slaves. They were free. So what role did they play? Well, again, the historian is driven just crazy with this because no one else talked about this early group of Africans as they arrived in the colony. So we don't know. Almost certainly what happened, and again, Karen Ordahl points this out, is that the English tried to communicate with these unfortunate individuals and just cut a deal with them on an individual basis. You come to me, come with me, be in my household, be a servant for a while, and, I'll provide you food and shelter and clothing, and, you're going to work for me, and that's just the way it is. And so these Africans had no choice. They were complete
they were complete pawns in this terrible event, but they fell into line with that. They just didn't have any choices. So when we talk about the first Africans arriving in 1619, I don't care what anybody says on television or anything else. Karen Oldroyd Kupperman did a great job on this. She researched this out very thoroughly, and they were not slaves. They were not slaves. You cannot say that the first slaves arrived in America in 1619. That is not true. There will be slaves later on, but it won't be these individuals, and it won't have happened in 1619. Now, there is a corollary to the story. A few years ago, I think in 2006, some researchers were working in England, and they came across a story that sort of related to this, and one of the researchers had a eureka moment, and he said, wow, this is that Jamestown situation. What they discovered was that, in fact, an English ship had met a Dutch ship in the Caribbean, and they'd teamed up. They'd thrown in together. And both ships had changed their names to hide their identity. In other words, they were pirating and buccaneering. And so while they were down in the Caribbean, they changed the names of their ships to hide their identity. That way the Spanish couldn't persecute them or prosecute them later. Well, if they camouflage their identity, then we have to give Karen Oldroyd Kupperman a pass on her researches in Holland. But as for the theory, she nailed it. She got it exactly right. This English ship teamed up with a Dutch ship. They did their buccaneering. They did their depredations. They did, in fact, grab these Africans from the Spanish colony. Then the English ship and the Dutch ship parted company. And the English ship went back to England, and in their logbook and their notes and like that, they said, yeah, these Dutch guys are going to go to Jamestown and drop off these slaves, drop off these individuals, these Africans. So Karen Oldroyd Kupperman's theory was perfect. She was right on the money, which just kind of, I don't know, enhances her reputation as a researcher. So with that in mind, we spent a lot of time on this slide. Here we are at 1619, and that is a big change. That's kind of what's going on as we move forward with the English colony in Jamestown. So in the next slide, we're going to transition. We're going to continue to discuss this situation with the Native Americans, and then we're going to bring the Jamestown colony, we're going to turn that into a royal colony. So let's transition and start talking about the relationship moving forward, the continued development of the Jamestown colony.
All right, as we continue on talking about the continued development of the Jamestown colony, we need to talk about their continued relationship with the Native Americans, the locals. Now, I've given you a little bit of a kind of a background on Pocahontas. There's how you spell it. For those of you guys who didn't spell it the first time, that's okay. Also known as Powhatan. I've given you kind of an alternative way to spell it right now. It's spelled several different times. And there's a picture of him. Let's take a look at that. This actually came from the logbook of Captain John Smith, so he's something of he's a pretty good artist. And that's almost certainly what Pocahontas actually looked like at the time. You can see the influence of this picture if you look at the you're looking at the image there on the left. If you look at the lower right, you can see the reflection, the influence of that picture on art at the time. At the bottom, I know it's hard to make out, but it says, Captain Smith taketh the king of the Pamunkey prisoners, 1609. Well, none of that happened. The image itself is actually quite meaningful. First, you can see that Pocahontas is pictured as being much, much taller than Captain John Smith. There's two things that are going on there. Number one, Captain John Smith was a little sawed-off run of a guy, but there's an ethnographic element to this. Among the English and the Europeans at the time, any king was thought of as being tall and of noble bearing and usually strong and super physically fit. It's just the nobility of the king, the office of the king, kind of transmitted that appearance to everyone. So the king of the Pamunkey, or Powhatan, was supposed to be really, really tall, physically fit, majestic character. More about the image later on.
But let's take a look at this. This is a building block slide. And so I want you guys to take really, really super strong notes here. I think actually, yeah, there it is right there in the middle of the slide. You're going to need this later. The information that's going on this slide, if you take 1302 with me, you're going to need it. So please take really, really strong notes here. Now, the first thing we need to talk about before we get to that 5-step cycle is kind of the background. As I pointed out in an earlier slide, the only thing the English want is the land. That's what they want all the time. They're always trying to get their hands on the land. So tobacco becomes the big cash crop, but they also need land for grazing. They're going to get cattle. Later on, they're going to get sheep. They need more land for food crops. More and more people are starting to come over because of what's going on back in England. In 1642, the English Civil War breaks out, and so lots of people are going to be trying to escape that. There's still a lot of religious intolerance, and people are going to be trying to escape to the New World, escape to the Jamestown colony over that. And the corporation itself is just going to be like recruiting really, really, really super hard. So the Jamestown colony keeps on growing, and because of that, they need more land. Now again, strong note here. In those early days, Powhatan had cut a deal with the English. Now, what's important about this, and Karen Ordo Kupperman talks about this a lot, and so does Richard White in his book, The Middle Ground. When the English arrived in 1607, the Powhatan tribe had only just gotten done with a war against the Cherokee, who were further inland. They'd only just gotten done with this long, terrible conflict with other Native Americans. And so when the English arrived, Opechancanough seized the English as a possible ally against other Native Americans. Please write that down. When the English first arrived in 1607, Opechancanough, Powhatan, seized the English as a possible ally against other Native Americans. So again, I can't overemphasize that. In those early days, the relationship between the Indians and the English was actually quite positive. It was very, very positive, despite what you see in that image in the lower left. So, I'm sorry, in the lower right. So, Wahun Sunicock, however, is Powhatan's brother. And there's kind of a modern rendition of what he probably looked like back in the day. But Wahun Sunicock, he was like, no, the English are evil. We got to get rid of them. They have to let go. These are bad people. This is going to turn out really badly. But Powhatan, Opechancanough said, no, let's give these guys a chance. Opechancanough was, he was much more positive about this, much more cautious. Well, in 1622, however, Opechancanough said, listen, okay, I got it. The English are no good. They're cheating us. They're not treating the land right. They're driving all the game away, and they're not acting as any sort of a meaningful ally. So they have to go. So there was a surprise attack in 1622, and that will fail. And the English are going to want to try and kill Opechancanough over this. For a long time, they try to hunt him down and get rid of him. Finally, Opechancanough, one resource talks about how in 1622 he was probably in his 70s by that time. He was a very old man, but he will pass away, and leadership will pass on to Wahun Sunicock. So Wahun Sunicock in 1644, he's going to lead an attack against the English, and that will not work either. That's going to fail. But between those two attacks, a cycle emerges, a pattern emerges. Now, I want you guys to write very, very strong notes here. We're going to go over each one of these bullet points one by one. So it's a 5-step cycle, and so we're going to wind up, starting back at the start again. So step 1 is encroachment. And for those of you guys who don't know what that phrase means, what I want to convey to you is that the English are simply getting too close to the Native Americans. They're too close in proximity. I use a broad phrase like this because encroachment might take many different forms. The actual example might be in one of a number of different ways. For example, in 1675, it's just when we talk about King Philip's War later on, the English were simply too close. They hunted out all the game. there was a murder had taken place, and the Native Americans got blamed for that, and they were completely innocent. And so when we talk about encroachment, there's lots and lots of different ways that that could take place. Another example, all the way out in 1874, a guy named Custer will lead an expedition into the Black Hills area looking for gold. And that will be located, and that sparks a gold rush. So again, treaties will be ignored, and that means that the white man is getting too close to the red man, and that is encroachment. So there's many, many different ways that that could be exhibited. So encroachment. The English, later the Americans, are getting too close. The next step in this cycle is a Native American reaction. Now I have a reaction there in kind of quotation marks because I want to use reaction as a very broad phrase. A reaction may take many different forms. For example, in 1675, King Philip Metacomet, his reaction to the English getting too close is to go try to make a deal with other Native Americans. We will talk about that. In 1876, Sitting Bull was on the reservation, and his reaction to the white man getting too close is, listen, I recognize that these treaties have been violated, and so I'm going to go live on the prairies as I've always lived. And he literally left the reservation. So Native American reaction could take many, many different forms. But under any circumstances, the next part of the cycle almost always is war will break out, and the natives are initially successful. That's the way it always is. In 1622, that almost worked. In 1644, that almost succeeded. In 1675, that will almost succeed. Metacomet will almost succeed in driving out the English. In 1876, Sitting Bull is going to leave the reservation, and Custer, and there's going to be this big giant, assault, and Custer got wiped out. So when we talk about the English later, the Americans, when they are subject to this Native American reaction, they almost always immediately get beat. But then the English, later the Americans, will react, and they're going to use teamwork and technology. So in your notes, write down teamwork as a subset. The English react. Subset 1, teamwork. Teamwork allows the English to fight in the winter. That is the key here. The Native Americans could not fight in the winter. Their economy would not allow that. They barely had enough food to get through the winter. But the English will pull together as a team. Either they can call on resources from England, or they can say to the working population, you guys double down and produce even more. And but all the able-bodied men, we're going to put you through militia training, and you're going to go out there and fight. And the rest of the community will support you. And so teamwork is going to be a big deal for the English, and they can call upon that, and that allows them to fight in the winter, usually when the other Native Americans could not fight. And that will happen again and again and again. The Sand Creek Massacre, that took place in the depths of winter. And you burn the Native American villages, you burn out their food supply, and they're going to starve to death. They're going to die. So the ability to fight in winter is going to be a big deal. English reaction, later American reaction, technology. So subset 2, technology. Now the technology is invariably guns. So we need to explore that for just a moment. Now I'm going to try and be quick on this because this presentation has gone on for nearly 2 hours already, and I'm sure you guys want to get on with it. So here we go, technology. And the technology that the English, later the Americans, are going to bring is invariably guns. So you have guns versus the bow and arrow versus an archer. Now let me draw your attention to the picture on the right, the lower right. At the very top edge of that, you can see some of the English with guns, a few English with guns, firing their weapons at Native Americans shooting bows and arrows. Well, we need to explore that for a minute. So it's men with guns versus men with bows and arrows. And immediately you would think, okay, well the guy, the archer, he's going to have the advantage. If you're an archer, you've spent a lot of time and energy and work developing your skills as an archer. I cannot overemphasize this. Creating an archer is a lifelong endeavor. It takes forever to create an archer. You start out as a little kid with a weak bow, You develop your upper body strength. As you get older, you get a stronger and stronger bow until you have one, a natural bow, and that's what Pocahontas is carrying there in that illustration. That may have a 120, 130 pound bow pull. But more importantly, to actually hit a target, you need to understand how to, if the target's farther away, you got to raise up your aim a little bit. If your target is moving, you got to be able to lead it out a little bit. And that takes a lifetime of skills to be able to do that. By contrast, teaching somebody how to use a gun, you poured all your technology into the gun itself. So for any one of you guys, for those of you guys who know this, I was a non-commissioned officer in the Army for many, many years. I could take one of these type of muskets, an arquebus, a matchlock musket, and in a few minutes I can show you how it works. And in a day I can make you into a pretty good musketeer. So I poured all the technology into the actual musket. Now let's put that into practical application. In a fight, the archer might be able to get off 2 or 3 shots by the time I got off 1 shot with a musket. So you've killed a musketeer, fine. But any other guy can pick up that musket and start using it right away. Whereas if the musketeers shoot 2 or 3 archers, you have destroyed an extremely important military asset that cannot be replaced. So while on the surface the archer looks like he has the advantage, as it turns out, in any kind of warfare, the men with the guns have the advantage. They have the advantage because the technology of the gun is so much better than the technology of the archer. So with that in mind, the English are going to react. They have teamwork, they have technology. Teamwork, the ability to fight and win. Technology, the gun. So let's transition then to the next one. So in one of these wars, the English are going to wipe out the Native Americans and they're going to grab the land. It's as simple as that, and it's as complex as that. The English only ever want the land. That's what they want. Once they wipe out the Native Americans and grab the land, the cycle begins again. So in the macro, think in the macro, the English have arrived on the east coast of the United States. Most of the Native Americans are going to die of disease. But the Americans, or the English, later the Americans, are still going to encroach upon the survivors. And that will spark a war. And then you go through this cycle, and then that wipes out all the Native Americans on the East Coast. Well, so the English, later the Americans, are kind of pinned to the East Coast. Well, then they're going to cross over into the Ohio River Valley. They'll get over the top of the Appalachians, the Smoky Ridge, the Smoky Mountains, and the Blue Ridge, and they'll be into the Ohio River Valley. They'll be in upstate New York. Once again, they encounter these Native Americans, and they go through this cycle. Most of the Native Americans will still die of disease, but then you're going to get this cycle, and that's going to wipe out the last of them. Finally, in the 1800s, the Americans by this time, they're also going to be approaching from the West Coast, but they'll be out into the Plain States. And they're going to wipe out the Native Americans. These Plains tribes, the Great Sioux Nation, the Arapaho, the Kiowa, the Shawnee, they're all going to be wiped out. Disease will get most of them, but this cycle will get the last of them. So please make sure you have really good, strong notes on this cycle. Again, if you take 1302 with me, you're going to need this. Going through the rest of 1301, you will need this again and again and again because we are not done talking about Native Americans by a long shot. So make sure you know where the slide is at so you can go back and reference it again, and make sure that you have good, strong notes on this. Well, I've said all I'm going to say on this particular slide. Let's go to the next slide, which, if I'm not mistaken, is simply a lead in to the next in this series. So here we are very quickly on this. This is English Colonialism Continued. We're taking the next step, and that will be the next in this series. We'll be talking about continued expansion in the Native Americans. We're going to have a couple of rebellions that we have to deal with, King Philip's War and Bacon's Rebellion. We'll talk more about government, the Dominion of New England. We'll talk about how government is exhibited in England. We'll continue to talk about religion, which is going to have a tremendous impact on what's going on in the colonies. We'll talk about the establishment, really, of the Plymouth Bay Colony. We'll talk about witchcraft. We'll talk about the Great Awakening. Later on, it'll be several presentations on down the line. We'll talk about the John Peter Zenger case, developing commerce, and this is going to be basically the slave trade, the triangular trade. That's going to be several presentations on down the line. And then we'll talk about the struggle for North America. That's the 7 Years' War, also known as the French and Indian Wars. So I have down at the bottom, follow the bouncing ball. That means we're going to be back and forth across to Europe on many, many different occasions, and for many good reasons. So your readings are in your text are still chapter 1 through 3, and I will talk to you on the next presentation.